Okay. All right, so welcome to the presentation. Let me just fix this for a second. There we go. Okay, so once again, my name is Maya Lightfoot. I'll be taking over for Tina. She's on a beautiful vacation right now, so it'll be me for the next 2 weeks. So I'm happy to be with you for the next two sessions. We've been talking about healthy eating so far. Today we're talking about decoding food labels. So we're going to talk about basically how to decode it, what to look for, what's new on the labels, because they have been updated over the last little while and still sort of in the process. So I'll be showing you sort of what the old one looks like, what the new one looks like, the thoughts behind it. And we're basically going to be taking a look at how to get more healthy foods in your home. Okay, so basically today the outline, we're going to talk about the ingredients list, old versus new, the nutrition facts table and how to read it, how to look at it, what to look for. Then we're going to talk about health claims and what they mean and why they're on the package of food that you bought. We're going to talk about the percentage of daily value and how to decipher what exactly that means when you're picking up a product. And we're going to talk about different micro and macronutrients. So sodium, sugar, protein. We're going to talk about fat and carbohydrates as well. All right, so does anyone use a nutrition label to buy food? You can put your hand up using this little button here if you want, like this. Let me know if you actually already use a food label to choose foods. Excellent. Okay, perfect. So some of you kind of have an idea already of what you're doing. So basically the food label has 3 different parts: the list of ingredients, the nutrition facts table, and that's sort of a set standard, as well as these health claims. So manufacturers have to follow detailed rules for all of these components. So basically, what's interesting, though, is that they're in the process of changing. So as of 2016, industry was given 5 years to update their nutrition facts label, and they were given a certain amount of criteria. So essentially, they were supposed to be ready December 14th of 2021. But because of COVID, they have had an extension, so they have until December of this year to update their all of their nutrition facts on their products. So we're going to go through each of the components on the food label, and then we're going to talk about the information you need to know when you go shopping. All right, so we're going to start with the ingredients list because it tells us everything that's in a product, and also whether the words are hard to find or hard to understand or not to understand. They're all going to be on there. So this is a list of the old ingredients list. So does anyone know how the ingredients list are put together? So is there a particular order? Does anybody know if there's a particular order? Yeah, from most to least, amounts of ingredients. So you're both right. So most to least, but not only most to least, but it's from heaviest. So they're listed by weight from most to least. So some things just weigh less than other things, but they're by weight. So when you read the ingredients list, they're by weight. Sorry, I was just muting somebody. Here we go. All right, so basically here you have a good idea of what's in the product. So whether it's a grain product, whether it's what's in the juices, what's all of the different sort of components. There's also a food allergens to check on the ingredients list. So now they have food allergens at the bottom of the list. And there are several priority allergens that must be declared on the package that's sold in Canada. So things like peanuts and dairy, eggs, shellfish, soy, So in 2012, Health Canada imposed food allergen labeling regulations. So on the priority allergens, there's 11 of them. So we said peanuts, there's tree nuts, there's milk, eggs, shellfish, fish, soy, wheat, sesame seeds, mustard, and sulfites. So all of these things must be on the label. They are in the ingredients list and they're also at the bottom of the list. So you can actually see at the bottom of this label that this contains almonds, wheats, and oat ingredients. So those, they have been pulled out by the allergens. So the ingredients list, this is in the product, listed by most to least by weight. Common allergens listed are all basically on this particular list. So moving on from the old to the new. So you look at the original, you're going to look at the changes that are made on this ingredients list. And Canada basically decided to make it easier to find, easier to read, easier to understand, so that basically it stands out and we have a better idea of what's going into our foods. So can anybody tell me what you think the differences are? What kinds of things do you see? What are differences that you see in the two different labels, from the top one to the new one?
They've broken the sugars down more, because before you couldn't tell what type of sugars, and that's
Yeah.
the biggest one, which is pretty nice, because knowing if it's natural or refined is a pretty big deal for what you're putting in your body.
So yes, the sugars have been broken down, but you know, whether they're natural or not, but they're all grouped. So if you look at the ingredients list at the top, we can see that there's whole grain, raisins, wheat bran, and then sugar, and then malted corn, and then barley syrup, salt, calcium. So they're kind of split up over the product. But in the bottom one, you see that sugars are in parentheses. So all of them by weight, okay? So again, by heaviest to least heaviest, so by most to least. Fancy molasses, brown sugar, they're all in one category. So there's 3 added sugars in this particular label. So yes, they have added the sugars. What else do you see? All right, how about I tell you? So they've also had to add the food coloring by name. Okay, so they've grouped the sugars. We've seen that. They've had to add the colors by name. So we have to know what kind of red coloring is in the product. They've also added sort of either black text on white or neutral background. They've used bullets to space them out, or at least commas to separate the ingredients. They have upper and lower case so that you can actually see that the differentiation between the words that are being used. When we're looking at the rest, so they've made it easier for people to decipher. So when you're looking even at the bottom after the red, we see that it contains wheat and eggs. But when you see here beside the red, there's spices. They have to break down what's in the spices as well. So, you know, let's say in the spices, there's pepper and salt and paprika and all of these. They have to break them down as well so that we know what's in there in case that one of those things might be an allergen. There might be some of the spices actually have gluten in them. So people need to know also whether there's gluten or not in a product, because some people are quite intolerant and it can make someone quite sick. So that's basically some of the new things. So it has ingredients and contains. Now for the next one, when we talk about the nutrition facts table, it begins with the serving size. So the amount of food that's in the product. So right now we're looking at the amount of food. We know that this is for 2 cookies and it's 30 grams. So what they've also done in the food labels, or in the new food labels, is that they've tried to make all of the different products more comparable. So before you would have some cookies where they'd show you what 50 grams looks like, 45 grams, 20 grams. Now they've tried to make them much more consistent. So when we're looking at this particular slide, we know that there is, for 2 cookies, it's 30 grams. And it's going to be closer to what a food guide, a Canada Food Guide serving. So they used to have different breads, used to be, well, this is what's the food label for 1 slice of bread. This is what the food label is for 2 slices of bread. But now when we know that they're trying to correspond to what people actually eat, usually when you have bread, you're having a sandwich. So on the label, you're going to see now what the nutrition facts are for 2 slices of bread. So take a look at your packages a little bit more close next time when we're done this. So this is the serving amount, so it's a specific amount of food, and we have to also compare to how much we actually eat. So do we eat typically 2 of these cookies? Or do we eat, 4 or 6? So then we have to multiply by a couple of different, multiply it. I know that when my mother-in-law chooses crackers, she always says, well, if they're the same amount of calories, I'm going to buy the crackers that I can eat more of. So sometimes it just, if I'm going to eat 10 crackers, then if I can get a box of crackers that has 10 crackers for 100 calories or 3 crackers for 100 calories, sometimes, we have to be a little bit more conscious of what we actually eat. So now they're making them a little bit more normal serving sizes. So now we have how much energy, how many calories are in this serving. And this is sort of 150 calories. We can easily look at it. The new labels are going to be much more obvious, and we're going to see that on the next slide. And then after that, we have the core list of ingredients. Every single label has to contain these core list of ingredients. Basically, the only ones that don't are fruits and vegetables, basically bread baked at the bakery. What other things don't typically have labels on them? I guess things that are fresh, like even when they give you a fresh meal, they have to put the label on it. So there's a lot of things that have a label on it. If you look at a water bottle, for example, you're going to see a water bottle and it's going to say this many grams, but then it's going to say no significant amounts, and that's how they can sort of get away with not having a full label on it. So when we're looking at this, it's easy to compare 2 different products because they all have the same amount of food on them. So we're looking at fat, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, and proteins on every single different product. Now, we also have the percentage of daily value, and we're going to be talking about that quite a bit over the next few slides. But what it does is it indicates whether there's a lot of a particular nutrient or a little bit of a particular nutrient. So when we're looking at just these cookies, 7 grams of fat is 11% of our daily, I'm going to say daily requirement. But of that 7, there are 3 grams of saturated fat, and that's 20% of our percentage of daily value, which is what we're going to talk about where those values come from. But we know that 20% is a lot more than when we're looking at a daily value. Anything under 5% is a little bit, and anything over 15% is a lot. So we know that in this particular cookie, there's a lot of saturated fat for our daily recommended values. So let's take a look at our new versus our old label. So when it came to the changes, we're going to show you the difference between the 2 labels and basically how they made it easier to differentiate. So let's look at first the serving size. So when we're looking at here, it says 1 cup, 250 milligrams, and it says it in French too, une tasse, 250 milligrams. So they give you both indications. On the original one, it just says 250 milligrams, but sometimes people who don't bake necessarily might not know what that looks like. So we know that 1 cup, if I'm going to have this, it's 250 milligrams. Okay, perfect. So we're going to know in 1 cup how many calories, and look how they've underlined it and made it a lot bolder. So we can see that it stands out. There's a line under it. We know how many calories are in there. We don't have to sort of, use our eyes to really sort of look for it. It's right there. It's underlined. So they've also made the serving size more consistent so that it's easier to compare similar foods. So if you're comparing 2 boxes of granola bars, 2 boxes of crackers, 2 cartons of milk, 2 bags of bread, we're going to be comparing approximately the same amount of things. And they've made the serving sizes more realistic, so they reflect more what Canadians typically eat. So the next one is the percentage of daily values. They've been revised based on scientific evidence there. So the other thing that's interesting is that they've also added a percentage of daily value to sugars. Now we're going to be going through that a little bit more, but a little bit later on. But what's interesting is that they have now added a percentage that goes towards sugar, and it's still going to be based on the daily values. Anything over 15% is a lot of a nutrient in a product. What's also interesting, if you look below, they have removed vitamin A and vitamin C because Canadians have been getting enough of these particular minerals and vitamins, and they've added potassium and calcium, iron. The calcium they've kept, but they've added potassium and iron. No, they've added potassium. Sorry, I'm looking at the two. I'm like, no, there's calcium and iron in both of them. They have added potassium because this is something that people aren't maybe getting enough of, and a very important nutrient for healthy blood pressure. So we need potassium for healthy blood pressure, and they put it in milligrams for potassium, iron, and calcium. So they've added not only the percentage of daily value, but they've also added the amount of milligrams that is found in that product. All right. Any questions about that? We're going to obviously go into more detail as we go on, but we're going to now talk about daily value because I think that's a really important topic when it comes to how do we go through a label? How do we compare them? How do we know if there's a lot or a little? Because different numbers mean different things for different nutrients, right? So when we're looking at the daily value, the benchmark to evaluate and compare nutrients quickly and easily. Now, based on the recommendations for a healthy diet. So when we're looking at a healthy diet, we're going to look at anywhere between 1,200 calories to 2,000 calories, and it's a percentage, remembering that a percentage is not necessarily a number, but it's going to be based on a healthy diet. We're going to sort of go through that a little bit later on. So this percentage is not meant to track the total amount of nutrients you have had for the day. It's more about the food we eat and how much of every nutrient we're getting within our diet, and making sure that we're getting a little bit of the nutrients that are not what we want and a lot of the nutrients that we want. So when we're looking at this particular label, we're looking again at 2 cookies, and we're looking at the percentage of daily value. So we're looking at 7 grams. We know that it's 11%, and of those 7 grams, 3 are saturated fats. So again, we know that 20% is a high amount of this particular macronutrient. So when you're looking at sort of going down the list, we see that cholesterol doesn't have a percentage of a daily value. Does anybody know why that is? We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, but eating cholesterol isn't what's going to affect our blood levels of cholesterol. It's mostly going to be the amount of saturated and trans fats and stress that are going to increase our bad cholesterol, not eating cholesterol necessarily. That's why eggs got a bad rap, but eggs are actually quite good for you. So when we also look down the list, we see that protein also doesn't have a percentage of daily value. And that's because most people get enough protein, and it's not really a health concern for Canadians, right? Especially if we eat a mixed or a balanced diet, there is no necessary, not necessary for us to get a percentage. We know that there's a certain amount of protein that our body can absorb, and we're going to talk about that a little later on, but knowing that there's no specific percentage, also because protein requirements are based on your body weight, and everybody's body weight is different. Okay, but we do see a percentage for fat, saturated fat, carbohydrates, sodium, and fiber. Okay, sugars, as we know, are coming on the new labels. All right, so let's talk about the nutrients based on, this is the table at which they compare or they use the percentage of daily value. So you see here that total fat is sort of the maximum requirement for fat in a healthy diet throughout the day. Of those 65 grams, 20 is your maximum, sort of not even requirement, is your maximum threshold that you should not go above of saturated and trans fats, because those are the ones that we need to minimize. So when we're looking at this percentage, we can sort of separate. We have 7 grams of fat, total fat. We have 3 grams of saturated fat and 1 gram of trans fat. So where is the other 3 grams of fat? So we have 3 grams of saturated, 1 gram of trans, which gives 4 of the 7. Does anybody know where the other 3 grams of fat are, or what they are? So typically we have saturated fat, trans fats, and we have unsaturated fats. And the unsaturated fats are the ones that are healthy. So we just need to have on the label what we need to be aware of, the ones that we need to be careful of. Now, also when we look at trans fats are no longer allowed to be added to foods. These particular trans fats are probably naturally occurring, because as of 2018, there was a sort of a law put in so that there couldn't be any added trans fats. Trans fats are like a double whammy. They increase your bad cholesterol and they decrease your good cholesterol. So we want to stay away from any added trans fats. And that should be easy because there's no longer allowed to be any added trans fats. But in some products like dairy, typically, there are naturally occurring trans fats, but they're still in this section of the label. We don't want to have too many of them. So now we're looking at these other ones, right? We have the carbohydrates, which is 300 grams. Fiber is 25 grams, and something that we want to strive for. Sodium, which is 2,400 milligrams, which is our maximum requirement. Most Canadians are getting more than that, but we have to know that that's the number that they're basing the percentage on. Cholesterol, 300 milligrams, and then iron, 14 milligrams. We want to make sure that we're getting enough iron in our diets because that helps with fatigue, with energy. It's a very important nutrient. So when we're looking at sodium, when we look just at the nutrient, at the facts label, we can see that 80 milligrams. For some, 80 is a big number. But when you're looking at the daily percentage, it's only 3%. So it's kind of why we need to have the percentage of daily value. If we didn't know that 80 was a little bit of sodium, then we would maybe be nervous about this product, especially if we're trying to manage our sodium intake. We're going to look at a little bit later on what the minimum requirement for sodium is, because we do need some in our diet, but we have based our nutrition facts or our daily values on sort of the maximum requirement so that we can manage that. So let's look at how they calculate the percentage of daily value. So they take the 80 milligrams that we see on the fact table, they divide it by the maximum sort of daily requirement value, which gives us 0.03, times 100 to get a percentage, and we get 3% of our daily recommended value. So this in terms of sodium is on the low side, right? But when we're looking at cookies, it's not necessarily something we're concerned about, but knowing that that's where we find out how to calculate the percentage. Now, can anyone remember how many calories there are per gram of carbohydrate, protein, and fat? Any? No, you don't remember. Okay, well, that's fine, right? It's honest. So when we're looking at carbohydrates and protein, they are both 4 grams per 4 calories per gram, and fat is 9 calories per gram. When we're looking at how much carbohydrate, we're looking at the carbohydrate here, 21 grams is 7%. Our recommended caloric intake of carbohydrates is about 300 grams a day, which is between 45 and 65% of our daily recommended intake. Protein is only 10 to 35% of our daily recommended intake, and fat is 20 to 35% of our daily recommended intake. So this is really important to know because this is what the daily value is based upon. So when we're looking at a 2,000 calorie a day diet, we're looking at these percentages. So we know that there's 4 calories per grams of carbohydrate, and it's recommended to get between 45 and 65% of our daily calories from carbohydrates. So 300 grams of carbohydrate equals to about 1,200 calories from carbs. For someone who eats 2,000 calories per day, 1,200 of those should come from carbohydrates, and that would be about 60% of their total calories. So when we look at comparatively, the recommendations for other nutrients like fiber or sodium are not related to the caloric intake. So that means that the daily value for these nutrients apply to most people regardless of how many calories they eat per day. So for example, if someone eats 1,500 calories a day or 3,000 calories per day, the recommended value for fiber is still 25 grams for everyone, and the daily recommended value for sodium is less than 2,400 milligrams. So does that make sense when we're talking about macronutrients versus micronutrients when it comes to looking at the label? So we have here total fat. So we have 65 grams of total fat is our maximum required of total fat throughout the day. And then within those 65 grams, 20 grams is our maximum intake for saturated and trans fats. So this is kind of where that percentage comes from. This is not sort of to aim towards. We're not looking to aim towards getting 65 grams of fat in our day. That is our sort of threshold, our maximum amount. So when we're looking even especially at trans fats and saturated fats, those are the ones we want to stay on the lower end of because those are the ones that can affect our health. So when we're looking at this percentage of daily value, this is really where we have to understand that the ones that we're looking to get a little bit of, a little is 5% or less of a particular nutrient. Moderate means anywhere between 5 to 15. So this is the moderate value. And then anything over 15% is a lot. So again, a lot or a little is very individual for different nutrients. So when we're looking at these particular nutrients, we want to make sure that we're trying to decrease the ones that we are looking to stay away from, which would be our saturated fats, our sodium, and sugars, because that, remember, is going to have a percentage. But we also want to make sure that we're getting enough of, or a lot of, our fiber intake and our vitamin and mineral intake. Okay, so those are really where we need to, when we're looking at labels, that's how we compare it. So let's see how we're doing with our cookies. So we know that we've already gone through here. Our fat is 11%, but our saturated fat is 20. Our sodium is 3%, which is not very high, right? Well, for a cookie, that's good, right? For carbohydrates, it's 25 grams. Now, when we're looking at carbohydrates, we know that we have 21 grams of carbohydrates. 1 of those grams is fiber, and 8 of those grams is sugar. So 9 grams out of the 21 are spoken for. So under carbohydrates, we have fiber, sugar. Does anybody know what the third nutrient under carbohydrate is? Where do the other 12 grams of carbohydrate come from? They come from starches, which is our complex carbohydrates. But again, starches are things that are essential for our bodies. We need them to think. We need them for every muscle contraction. We need them for sort of blood sugar, for energy, for thinking, etc. So we need to concern ourselves more with getting more fiber, because we know that fiber doesn't have any calories. Fiber helps us stay full. Fiber helps us stay regular. And we also want to minimize the amount of sugar that we're getting into our bodies. So again, getting more of fiber, minerals, and vitamins, and we want to get it less of the added sugar, saturated fats, trans fats, and sodium. So basically, it's been broken down, easier for us to decipher and comparing products. Right? So moving on to looking at fats. So we have here do you think it's a new label or an old label? Well, it says new, never mind. So we have one hamburger, 113 grams for the burger, and it's 280 calories. Now, how many of those calories, or how many of those, how many grams of fat are we getting in this particular burger? When we're looking down under the calories, it's 280 calories. So we're getting 20 grams of total fat, which is 27% of our daily value. Is that a lot or a little? You can just put it in the chat. So we know that anything over 15% is a lot. Perfect. Okay. Now, of those 20 grams of total fat, we have 9 grams of saturated fat and 1 gram of trans fat. So that's 50% of our daily intake of our saturated fats comes from this one hamburger. So that is definitely considered a lot, right? Definitely more than 15%. So let's look at the next one here. So choosing lower fat means that you're going to get 3 grams of fat or less per serving. So this is, maybe harder to choose when you're getting a hamburger, but then this is something that we might want to minimize. We might not want to have 2 of these hamburgers, because then we get 100% of our day's worth of saturated and trans fats. So remembering how much do we normally eat? Hopefully it's just 1. And this is something that we might want to eat occasionally and not regularly, right? When we're looking at how do we get, or how do we moderate the amount of food that we get into our bodies, or the amount of nutrients we get into our bodies. So when we're looking at choosing saturated or trans fats, you want to go for 2 grams of less per serving, or 8% of daily value or less per serving. Again, maybe not 100% possible when you're choosing a hamburger, but this is when you have to look at your whole diet. Is my, total fat intake high across the day? So do I have bacon in the morning? Do I have a hamburger for lunch? And do I have a marbled steak or ribs at night, because then we know that our fat and saturated fat intake would be very high. So when we're looking at our throughout the day, we can see definitely that we have 27% of our total fat intake coming from this one burger. So maybe we have to minimize the amount of, extra fat intake that we have throughout the day. Are we adding cheese to this? Are we adding mayonnaise to this? Are we adding bacon to this? Every time I see one of those A&W commercials with sort of like the cheese and the bacon and the French fries hanging out of this hamburger, I could just sort of feel my heart going, oh my goodness, that's just like a heart attack in a burger. But fine, occasionally, right? We can have these treats occasionally. It's about the big picture. How often do we eat it? How much do we eat of it? Are really, really the important questions here. So we know that when we're looking at this burger, fat would definitely be one of those things that we're looking for, because we don't really have to worry much about carbohydrates. There aren't many. We only have 1 gram of fiber, and I don't even know where that fiber would come from. 19 grams of protein in this burger. Sodium, look at the sodium. 20% of our daily requirement comes from this hamburger. Now, what's interesting too is if you're going to be comparing regular burgers, whether there's bison or there's what is the other meat that I was just Angus, and there's even the no meat burgers. Really interesting to compare, because these might not be any different. Sometimes sodium and sugar is higher on the ones that aren't meat, but the saturated fat is typically higher on the ones that are meat. So always really just being aware. Just because it's a vegetarian product doesn't mean that it's healthier. Okay, it's just you're getting different nutrients there. So just being aware of that. Well, we are getting 17% of our iron. That's good, right? If you're looking at increasing your iron intake. So we want to avoid the trans fats, because again, higher the amount of trans fats we get in, it increases the bad cholesterol in our body, and it decreases the good cholesterol in our body. So trans fats were basically created to keep things on the shelf longer. So they took an unsaturated fat and they hydrogenated it. So they added, different molecules to it to keep it from going bad quickly. So this is what they did after the World Wars to make sure that there was enough food on the shelvings and then they could last a little bit longer. So just, knowing that they're not good for you and they have been removed so that we can be a little bit healthier, right? We want to make sure that we eat things that are good for our bodies as much as possible. Now, let's put this in practice. Let's compare fat of 2 glasses of milk. On the left, we have 1 cup of 1% milk, and on the right, we have 1 cup of homogenized milk. Does anybody know what MF stands for? Not sure if I'm here by myself, but MF is milk fat. So when you're looking at yogurt or cheese, MF is milk fat. Okay, so when we're looking at this, let's look at the nutrient fact. So looking on the left-hand side, we know that these are old labels because they don't have the 1 cup beside the 250 milligrams, which is fine. So on the left, we have 1%. We're comparing two, remember when we're comparing 2 labels, we have to compare that they're the same amount of food, right? So sometimes if you're looking at maybe cream, or if you're looking at coffee, milk, or those coffee sweeteners, it's per tablespoon, okay? So just being aware of the amount that's revealed right here, and that amount of calories that's connected to it. So for this particular 250 milligram glass of 1% milk, it's 110 calories. So we're looking at the 2.5 grams of fat, of total fat, which is 4% of our daily recommended value. And of that 2.5, we have 1.5 grams of saturated fat and 0.1 gram of trans fats. And again, remembering that with dairy products, typically the trans fats are naturally occurring. So not as bad for you necessarily in your body because they're not man-made, but they are part of the product. We still want to, have less of them, but again, naturally occurring is better. Now, on the other side, with this homogenized milk, same amount, 1 cup, we have 160 calories, but look at this, the difference in the fat content. So there's 9 grams of total fat, which is 14% of our daily recommended value. Now we know that 15% or more is a lot, but we're kind of on the edge here of a lot, but still in the moderate amount. It's when you look down at the saturated amount of fat. So 5 grams of the 9 grams is saturated. So we have 27% of our daily recommended intake that is saturated. So when we're trying to compare the two, which one do you think is a healthier option when it comes to minimizing saturated fats, right? Kind of a no-brainer there. So we're also looking down at the bottom here. Sorry. Down at the bottom here, when we're looking at milk products, what other things are we typically looking to get when we're buying a dairy product? What mineral or vitamin is really important when it comes to a dairy product or a milk product? So we know that we typically are looking for calcium. Calcium and vitamin D are typically the 2 minerals and vitamins that are included or that are part of our dairy products. So again, if you are looking at staying away from dairy, let's say dairy gives you stomachache or it gives you, gastric discomfort, or you're just trying to stay away from dairy, right? These are options that we have. There are so many alternatives. There's soy and rice and oat and flax and hemp. There's so many different, I'm going to say, sort of milk substitutes. But when we're trying to substitute milk product, we also have to remember that not only are we trying to find something to put on our cereal or to bake with, we also need a replacement for the calcium and vitamin D. Does anybody know what calcium is for? I'm sure you guys know this. It's for your bones. We need calcium for our bones. And we need vitamin D. It's called the sunshine vitamin, but vitamin D is really important for energy, it works with the calcium to help strengthen our bones. Vitamin D is a very important vitamin and something that we don't get as Canadians between the months of October and April. So important to also, supplement if you need to, if you're not drinking milk or if you're not eating any of the products that have calcium, or sometimes they have enhanced or added vitamin D so that you can have those nutrients if you're having a milk substitute. But just read the label because sometimes they don't. Some don't and some do. So very important to remember that. We need to not only get the calcium, but the vitamin D and being aware of the fat content. So it's kind of like a big picture kind of thing, right? So when we're looking at, again, there's no, when we're looking at the cholesterol, we see that on the left side, there's 10 milligrams, and on the right, there's 35 milligrams. Again, no daily percentage that we're looking at. There's no percentage of daily value. But does it matter that there's cholesterol in these particular products, right? When we know it's really not about cholesterol, it's about the amount of saturated and trans fats that we eat that really has a lot to play on. But what's interesting is when we look at food claims or nutrient claims, there's going to be some nutrients or some boxes or some companies that are going to put cholesterol free, on the boxes because they want you to buy it, because people who have high cholesterol might be like, oh, you know, I'm going to get these just because there's less cholesterol. But, you know, licorice doesn't need to have cholesterol in it, but it has lots of sugar in it. So again, it's about the whole picture. So let's talk about sodium. We're going to talk about sodium, and sodium is basically table salt, right? Anything that they add salt to, processed foods, is basically found in almost everything. Even vegetables have a naturally occurring sodium in them. Now, what could be the issue if we eat too much salt? Does anybody know? Why is eating too much salt a health concern? So we know that having too much salt can increase blood pressure, and having blood pressure is a health concern that increases the risk of heart disease and stroke. That's why it's especially important to cut down on sodium if you have high blood pressure, right? When it comes to, it's not necessarily the cholesterol, it's the sodium and the saturated fats. But there is also a minimum requirement of sodium. Does anybody know what the sort of healthy adults should have no more than how many milligrams of sodium each day, according to the Heart and Stroke Foundation? What's the maximum amount? I'll throw it in the chat. I think I've told you this already. I'm pretty sure we've seen it already. Anybody, any idea? Okay, 2,400 milligrams. Now, does anybody know what 2,400 milligrams actually looks like? Or how much food is that? How much is that when it comes to, what does it look like? You're going to be very surprised if you don't know. So daily recommendation is 2,300 milligrams or less. Does anybody know what that looks like? It's 1 teaspoon of salt is 2,400 milligrams. So if we get more than a teaspoon of salt in our day, which most Canadians do, you're getting a lot of sodium. So if we eat things like packaged foods, frozen dinners, you know, mixed meals, typically there's usually sodium, and sodium is definitely a preservative. It also makes things taste better. But did you know that there's also a minimum requirement of sodium? Sodium is really important. We need it for what? Like essential. We need sodium in our bodies. Without sodium, with zero sodium, we die, basically. So does anybody know what it's used for? So sodium is needed in the body to regulate fluids and blood pressure and to keep muscles and nerves running smoothly. So the amount of sodium considered adequate to promote good health in adults is 1,500 milligrams per day. So we still need some of the sodium because we actually need our heart to pump and our muscles to contract. So has anybody ever heard of marathon runners basically drinking too much water? Well, sometimes it's really because they've sweated too much and all of the sodium comes out of their pores. They don't eat enough sodium to maintain the amount of sweating that they do, and they don't eat or drink any fluids as they're running to top up their sodium intake. So basically, if you're not getting enough sodium and you're doing a lot of exercise, you're sweating, you're outside, you're just drinking plain water, you're not helping your heart pump or your muscles contract. So this is how it could be dangerous. It's very difficult to get to that particular end, but it does happen, right? So very important to remember that sodium is important, but it's important to get less than a teaspoon of sodium a day. So when we're looking at trying to get low sodium, means 200 milligrams or less per serving, which is about 8% of daily value or less. Okay. So after this, we're going to take about a 2-minute break just so that everybody can have a stand up, maybe a couple jumping jacks or a bio break if you need more water or coffee. But we are going to first talk about carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates, we said, are broken down into 3 different things. We said there is fiber, sugar, and starch. So does anybody know what the fiber recommendations are? And they're different for men and women. Fiber recommendation. What are we looking to achieve every day in terms of fiber intake? Because fiber is really important. Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. So 25 to 35, 25 is the minimum requirement of fiber. So women are aiming to get 25 grams per day, and men are aiming to get 35 grams per day. So when you're looking at a carbohydrate food like a bread or a cracker, cereal, you're trying to find something that's going to give you a little bit more fiber. Why? Fiber doesn't have any calories. Fiber doesn't have any calories because it's not used for energy. It actually slows down the digestive process because your body has to break it down, and your body can't absorb the fiber of the grains that are being eaten. So it's basically, I'm going to say, a free-for-all when it comes to fiber. We want to increase our fiber intake if we can, if we're not getting more than 25 grams per day. But you want to increase it slowly. And the more fiber you have, the more water you need to drink. Because as much as increasing fiber is good for you, if you don't drink, you're going to be doing the opposite of what you need to do when it comes to elimination, right? So fiber is definitely your colon plow. It helps move things along. Now, when it comes to sugar recommendations, does anybody know at this time, because it's not on this label, it's on the new labels, what the sugar recommendation is? And this is not, this is naturally occurring sugars, so basically in fruits and vegetables and stuff like that, as well as added sugar. What's the maximum amount of sugar that the World Health Organization has kind of put out? And I mean the Canadian government or the Canadian recommendations have come out. 36 grams. Okay. So what's interesting is that we are looking at when we're going to be getting the new labels, and they're going to be putting out sugar percentage, because they are going to be putting sugar percentage. Basically, it's going to be 100% is 100 grams. That doesn't mean we're aiming for 100 grams of sugar a day. Okay, there's no recommended value for sugar because there's naturally occurring sugars in vegetables, milk, fruits, and stuff like that. But the World Health Organization set a guideline in 2015, which recommends adults and children reduce their daily intake of free sugars, which is added sugars, to less than 10% of their total energy intake. So even a further reduction to below 5%, or roughly 25 grams, which is 6 teaspoons per day, would provide additional benefits. And so basically, if you're looking at 25 grams or less of added sugar per day, you're really sort of at sort of the top end of the sugar intake requirement, because basically, you know, the recommendations are based on total evidence reviewed when it comes to body weight and dental issues and obesity and chronic health conditions and diabetes and cancers and stuff like that. So to keep it simple, minimize your added sugar intake by aiming for 5 grams of less per serving when looking at foods. And that could be really, really challenging. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to get cereal that's under, 5 grams of sugar that tastes good enough, or those kinds of things, but you get your body used to tasting less sugar. Or when you're looking at different things, like you'd be surprised at how much sugar is in pasta sauce or in yogurt or in what are other things you don't expect to find sugar in when it comes to processed foods, everything in a box, basically. Take a look at the sugar intake. And if you can try to find things that come with, 5 grams of sugar or less, or even when we come out with the new labels, we're going to be trying to find, again, just like the daily percentage of value, 8% or 5% or less, or at least less than 15% of daily added sugar, because we know that 15% is equal to 15 grams. We want 25 grams or less of added sugar a day. So that means, don't eliminate fruits, don't eliminate vegetables, naturally occurring. If you're going to have some milk, we know that there's going to be some naturally occurring sugars in those. Those are not the ones we're trying to eliminate. It's the ones that are added. Like when you look at the label and you see brown sugar, molasses, honey, maple syrup, sugar, refined sugar, all those kinds of things, right? All of the added ones that are going to be in the label. Any questions about sugar? Or added sugar, carbohydrates. So again, we're looking here, we have the carbohydrates is 13 grams. Of those 13 grams, we have 2 that are fiber and 6 that are sugars, which is 8. So the remaining 5 grams are the starches. Those are the ones that we actually use for energy. All right, any questions? How are we doing with that? Thumbs up, is everybody okay? All right, well, I'm going to give you a 2-minute break. It's 10:58. 2 minutes to get up, go to the bathroom, refresh your coffee or some water, get a snack if you need one, stand up, stretch, at least stand up and stretch, and we'll be back in 2 minutes. All right, welcome back. So over the break, just for interest, I went into my fridge and got some almond brie and some oat milk. And it's interesting. Well, we have my kids and I have sort of gastric issues when it comes to dairy. So this is why we have this. But looking at the labels, and when we talked about sort of fortifying with calcium and vitamin D, my oat milk has 23% of calcium and 10% of the recommended vitamin D, but also has vitamin B and B12, and B12 is typically only found in meat products. But my almond milk, there's no calcium, and there's no, they don't have vitamin D on this one because it's an older label, but just to, just out of interest, when it comes to, after this, go into your fridge and into your cupboards and take a look at what you have. And you might be surprised by things when it comes to, is there added sugar in things, or is there added sodium, or when it comes to, do I have any trans fats in this? And if there's added trans fats, or if it's hydrogenated, like margarine used to be, but then they stopped doing it because they're not allowed after 2018. But just sort of being aware of these very specific little things that can really make a huge difference in your entire diet. Any questions so far? How are we doing? Alrighty. Okay, so moving on. So how much sugar? So we mentioned that the new food labels will include daily percentage of total sugar to help compare the contents of different foods to help us understand the relative amount of sugar in the context of daily consumption. So the total value for the amount of total sugars is based on 100 grams. This value is not the recommended level of intake, right? It's the amount of total sugar that is consistent with healthy eating patterns, a diet with where sugars are mostly from fruits, vegetables, and plain milk. So even though the food label won't discern between added sugar and natural sugar, they will still help us make informed decisions for the health of our bodies. So again, trying to stick to a little sugar, which is less than 5%. Or basically trying to stick to whole foods, which are fruits, vegetables, whole grains majority of the time, and it'll be less of a concern. So looking at this here, we can see that in this 1 cup, on the new label, we can see that there's 22 grams of sugar, which is 22% of our daily value, which is high. Right? And look at the bottom of the footnote here. So this is going to tell you, it's going to remind you that 5% or less is a little and 50% or more is a lot. And they have it in French and in English, which is pretty great for Canadians. So everyone has an idea of what they're looking for. Now, which one of these two products contains less sugar? So what's interesting is that they're both the same product, they're just listed differently. So ingredients list A is the old pattern, and you see how there's a gray background behind it. There's no separation between the different words. There's commas, but everything is uppercase wording, etc. On the B, they have ingredients and they have sugars, and all of the sugars are grouped into one. So we know that there's 3 sugars in this particular product. We have bullet points between every single word, so we know that how many, maybe ingredients are in there. And then we have the contains, which is big. The contains meaning the allergens are being brought out: wheat, egg, and soy. So this just shows another way of how they've made helpful changes on the new food labels and how they've modified the ingredients list, really, just to make sure that things stand out, things are important. There's just a lot of much more information of the sugars. Now, what's another thing is that sugars, I think I looked it up once and looked at how many different words sugar can come in. And there was probably close to 100 words. And they're sometimes a little bit sneaky because they might not sound like sugar. We know that molasses, brown sugar, honey and those kinds of things, but they have dextrose and maltose and fructose, and there's sugar alcohols, and there's agave, and there's, all kinds of, even when they have like pureed concentrate, or they have, basically, if there's a O's at the end of it, it's sugar. There's so many different sugars. So when it's spread out on the list, like on A, sometimes you miss a couple. But in B, now that they're all grouped together, some of these words we might not recognize, but we know that they're in the sugars parentheses. We know that they're sugars, right? So now, sugar in this particular ingredients list is the first ingredient because of how much, when you put them all together, it weighs the most. So maybe we might not want to buy this particular product because it has more sugar than any other ingredient. Okay, something to look out for. All right, now let's look at protein facts. So as mentioned earlier, there's no percentage of daily value on the food label for protein because protein intake is generally adequate for most Canadians, right? So how much protein do you need? Do you know? And what's interesting is that as much as protein is a healthy component for active bodies, you need much less protein than carbohydrates. Does anybody know what sort of either percentages or grams we're looking at when it comes to protein for your body weight? So for sedentary or moderately active recreational athletes, so maybe you exercise 4 to 5 times a week for about 30 minutes, your requirement is approximately 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so protein intake is based on your body weight. So as an example, if you are 80 kilograms, you need between 64 and 80 grams of protein a day if you are moderately active. Okay, so the protein requirement is achieved by eating a variety of foods from all of the food groups throughout the day. So we get protein from the dairy, we get protein from some vegetables, we get protein from basically our protein foods, meats, legumes, nuts, cheeses, all kinds of things. We get protein from a lot of different areas. Even if you look at your bread and crackers, usually there's some protein in there as well. So, but why we don't need as much is that there's only a certain amount of protein that your muscles can absorb in one sitting. So skeletal muscle protein synthesis is maximized by approximately 30 grams of high quality protein during a meal. So after the 30-gram threshold, muscle building and repair levels off, and the protein will go to other parts of your body. So basically excess energy will be stored as fat or will go into the toilet. So it's important to know because the typical North American diet, there is, mostly carbohydrates in breakfast, but then we sort of increase protein as we go. But we could have a steak at night and it could be, 60 to 80 grams of protein. But when we're looking at spreading out approximately 90 grams of protein per day, maybe try 30, 30, 30. So 30 grams in the morning, 30 grams at lunch, and 30 grams for supper, so that you can kind of spread it out evenly throughout the day. And what that does is that also slows down the absorption of food because protein will take a lot longer to digest. So you're going to stay full a little bit longer and you are not going to be as hungry because you're going to be taking a lot more time. It's going to take a lot more time to digest. It's going to stay in your body a little bit more. You're not going to have you're not going to have any sort of peaks of carbohydrate intake when it comes to the carbohydrate or the starch peak. So it's going to level out your blood sugar. And it's going to just give you the most bang for your bite. It'll be easier on your digestive system. And there'll be more room for other vital nutrients from foods like vegetables and fruits and healthy fats and whole grains. So protein, as much as it's an important part of a healthy diet, we don't need as much as we think we need. So putting it all together, a quick rule of thumb when you're buying a snack or a cereal or a grain product, it's the 2, 3, 4, 5 rule. Okay, so 2 grams or less of saturated fat, 3 grams or less of total fat, 4 grams or more of fiber, and 5 grams or less of sugar. Now, when we're looking at these are like the ideal right? The ideal when we're looking for a grain product when it comes to whether that's breads when you're bringing into your house, cereal, whatever it is that you take in terms of carbohydrates. Now, 1 teaspoon of sugar is 4 grams of carbohydrates. So when you're looking at 5 grams of sugar, if you're looking at a slice, if it's 1 slice of bread, and we know that 4 grams of sugar is 1 teaspoon, we have, 1 gram of teaspoon in a slice of bread. So be careful with that. 5 grams or less of sugar when it comes to a whole bowl of cereal, that's totally acceptable. Or also when it comes to sodium, you want to make sure that we're staying on the lower end of sodium, right? When we're looking at a frozen meal, you might be surprised, but it's usually over 600 milligrams or more. And that's sort of when, we're looking at a 600 milligram of sodium or less is about a sensible choice, but there's a lot of them that could have your whole day's worth of sodium. Have you ever had those noodles that you put hot water in and I don't know what they're called, but they're like noodles and you have this packet and you put the packet in and then you have the noodles? Sometimes that's 2 or 3 times your daily, that's it. The 2 or 3 times your daily recommended intake of sodium. So just being really careful. So this is a really great rule when you're going to the grocery store: 2, 3, 4, 5. Saturated fat, regular fat, fiber, and sugar. Things we need to look out for. Now, the final food label component that we're going to talk about are the nutrient claims or the nutrition claims. These are really, really interesting. There's 2 types of nutrition claims on food. So there's a nutrient content claim and there's a health claim. So these claims also have to follow certain rules through Health Canada to make sure that they're consistent and not misleading. So these claims are optional, so they're not found on all food products. And when we're looking at nutrient content claims, here we're looking at nutrient content claims and health claims. So when we're looking at something like, looking at here, keywords, if you're looking at free, like fat-free, sodium-free, sugar-free, no, 0, or without, the food has to provide an amount of nutrient that is so small and basically insignificant, it will likely not have any effect on your body. So there has to be such a little amount that it's insignificant. So no sugar, no salt, no, no cholesterol, no fat. It's really important that this is a sort of scientifically proven that there's not enough of this nutrient to make any difference in your body. But what's interesting is sometimes they're going to put, like I said, cholesterol free on something that never had cholesterol in it to start with. Or when they say, sorry, no added sugar. Let's say they have no added sugar on a can of of fruit, and you look at the label and it says 6 grams of sugar. Knowing that there's no added sugar, meaning that the sugar that's in there is naturally occurring. Okay, so they're sneaky. Okay, so making sure that when you're looking at the label, you really look at the whole picture. Just because it says, I was in a hair salon once, this was years ago, and the girl was so excited because she found licorice that had no fat in it. So she was sharing it with everybody because she was so excited. But it was all sugar, and sugar turns into fat if it's not used. But anyways, it's that you get sucked into these claims. So very important just to look at the whole package. So when we're looking at low or little or few, the food provides a very small amount of the nutrient. So specifically, if it says low fat, it has to mean 3 grams of fat or less per serving. There always has to be almost like certain requirements when it comes to the low part. Okay, so low sodium, low or few, little. they're significant. They're specific amounts, but they're specific to how they can be used, which is what I'm trying to say. So when it comes to even things like when we have low here, but when we have, let's say, a high or a good source of fiber, or a high in vitamin A, or a good source of protein, a good source of fiber, when it comes to good or high, those are also specific numbers. So I think when it comes to fiber, if it's under 4 grams, it's a good source. If it's over 5 grams, it's an excellent source. So these words are very specific, sort of scientifically chosen, okay? So when it comes to reduced or less or fewer, the food is processed, obviously modified, so that it contains at least 25% less of the nutrient when compared with a similar product. So when you're looking at, we're going to see here on the next slide, when we're looking at sort of blue menu, for example, and it has reduced sodium, it has to be at least 25% reduced than the original brand, or reduced fat or less fat. It has to be less fat than the original product. It has to be compared to something. It can't just say reduced or less if there's nothing to compare it to. Okay, so these are basically rules that are set up by Health Canada to make sure that they're not misleading, and they're consistent throughout the entire board. So now when we're looking at light, this food is processed or modified so that it contains at least 25% less than the nutrient when compared with a similar product, but light can refer to fat, it can refer to calories, it can refer to color. So I don't know if you've ever bought light maple syrup or light olive oil. It's not light in terms of less fat. It's light because of the color or taste. So that is maybe misleading. I know that my mother-in-law bought olive oil once, and she was very excited that it was light because she thought it was less fat, but it's olive oil. It is fat, but it was a lighter color or a lighter smell or a lighter taste. So being very, again, they want you to buy their product. That's their job. That's how they make money, right? So these are all put out with sort of specific ideas in mind. So usually when it's reduced in calories. When it's less, it could be less sodium. And again, when we're looking at reduced or less, or fewer or low, it's usually the nutrients that we want less of, right? Like the saturated fat, trans fats, sodium, cholesterol, etc. When we want more of, it's typically the ones that we want more of, which is the fiber or the vitamins, minerals, etc. Okay. Now with these are health claims. Now there are health claims which are statements about the helpful health effects of certain foods when consumed within a healthy diet. For example, the one that's on the box here, a healthy diet with adequate calcium and vitamin D and regular physical activity help to achieve strong bones and may reduce the risk of osteoporosis. What kind of package do you think this might be on? What typically has calcium and vitamin D? Typically are dairy products, right? Milk, excellent, right? So this might be a health claim that's put on a milk carton because they want you to buy their product, and you can actually see, okay, well, I'm getting calcium and vitamin D, so maybe I'm going to have stronger bones. But if you're drinking milk, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're physically active. So these are things that they have to be real. They are 100% sort of approved. They have to be approved by Health Canada to go on your box. So if you're looking at cereal, for example, sometimes they say, I remember Cheerios being something about a diet high in fiber helps reduce the risk of heart disease or high cholesterol. Cheerios contains a high amount of, so they do it on purpose to get you to buy their product, or a diet containing foods high in potassium and low in sodium may reduce your risk of high blood pressure or stroke, et cetera, et cetera. So they indicate the relationship between diet and disease and must be supported by scientific evidence. So these are optional, okay? They may or may not be found on foods, and they have to meet a certain criteria. So to make a health claim about calcium, vitamin D, and regular physical activity, the product has to be high or very high in calcium, has to be high in vitamin D, limited in alcohol, and have more than 40 calories if the food is not a fruit or vegetable. Okay, so there are lots of sort of interesting criteria. So other claims, often referred to as general health claims, have to appear in recent years. They have appeared on recent years and in front of on the food labeling. They include broader statements. So these are healthy for you, or they're healthy choices. You might see symbols or logos, right? Like the sensible solution or the blue menu. So these claims are not developed by the government. Instead, they're developed by the third-party corporations. So I don't know if you've seen these health checks anywhere, but an organization that has this health check on it by the Heart and Stroke Foundation, they have to pay for that. So while it's required that the information be truthful and not misleading, you should not rely only on the general health claims to make food choices. So you really need to, again, take a look at the whole picture. These health check claims, I don't know if you've ever looked at the requirements for getting the health check, but you can find that online. What are the criteria? They're not super duper high. Like you just need to pay a lot of money for that to be on your box, right? So that's what's unfortunate. Blue menu is based on President's Choice only. Sensible Solutions is the other. When it comes to whether it's Loblaws or whether it's Sobeys, we have two Irresistible brand, those kinds of things. So they will use those on the lower end of the comparable product that they put out for you. So any questions about these? So when we're looking at the nutrition facts, I want you to look at your food in your house and the foods that you go to regularly. So look at the nutrition labels on your go-to foods, on the pasta sauce that you buy, on the cereal or bread, or on the burgers that you buy, or basically anything you bring into your home. So I want you to think about looking at those and seeing if next time you go, you can compare to a different product and see if there's anything that's a better option. You can use the 2, 3, 4, 5 trick when it comes to buying any type of a snack or grain product. So 2 grams of saturated fat or less, 3 grams of 2 grams of saturated or trans fats or less, 3 grams of total fat or less, 4 grams of fiber or more, and 5 grams of sugar or less. So just thinking about those when it comes to buying products. Focus on building a healthy plate. So we want to stay away from as many processed foods as possible. So this is why when we say you want a wholesome, balanced diet. So buying foods that are not necessarily in a package. So when we're looking at fruits and vegetables, whole grains, whether you have beans and legumes, nuts, etc. So spending time really working on your healthy plate in terms of a balanced diet for the body for the whole day. Record your physical activity in steps. Canada requires a minimum of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week. So whether that's 3 times 30 minutes, whether that's 20 minutes every day, that's a minimum. So at least take the time to use the activity to build your bones and to use the protein and nutrients that you're getting in your body. 150 minutes a week, and continue to set SMART goals. So whether that's, SMART, obviously specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely goals. So whether that's specific, meaning I want to increase my physical activity by 30 minutes a week, it's specific. I can measure that. I want to decrease my sugar intake by 10%. I want to increase my fiber intake to 25 grams a week. So these are all things that you can actually record. You can actually write down and measure and attain. So that's why they have to be very specific and action-oriented, not result-oriented. And these are some great resources that that we recommend and that are, again, based on scientific research. Even when you look at dietitians of Australia, they're very progressive and they have very interesting resources. I love their stuff. So you know that Australia is not influenced by the Canadian government or not at all, right? Of course. But what's interesting is if you're ever interested to look at the food guides across the entire globe and, you know, worried about the Canadian Dairy Bureau having any influence on our Canadian food guide, well, the Dairy Bureau of Canada had no influence in Japan for their milk on their guide, or in Russia, or in Hungary, or in the Mediterranean, yet they also have dairy on their food label. Same thing with when it comes to meats and alternatives, all of them have them at a smaller sort of amount than when it came to fruits, vegetables, and carbohydrates. And this is across the globe. So we have no influence on every other country when it comes to whether it's Italy or whether it's Australia, whether it's Singapore. So it's very interesting to take a look at the food guides across the world, because there must be some scientific evidence that bases every single human on this earth to get at least those nutrients at a minimum. And if you would like to follow us on social media, we have Nutrition Month coming up starting next week. So we're going to have lots of interesting stuff coming up on our Facebook and Instagram page. So this was Mission Nutrition number 3, Decoding Food Labels. And then next week, we are going to be at our last Mission Nutrition Part 4, kind of wrapping it all up together, and lots of interesting information coming up next week as well. So we're at the end of our workshop. I'm going to turn off the recording. And if you have